March 6, 1944. The sky above Berlin hung heavy with the color of old bruises, purple-gray clouds streaming eastward on winds that carried more than weather. In his opulent study at Karen Hall, his vast hunting estate north of the capital, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring stood before floor-to-ceiling windows, one hand gripping the frame with fingers that had grown soft from years of excess. Below, the manicured grounds stretched toward forests that had once seemed limitless, a domain befitting the man who commanded the mightiest air force Europe had ever seen. But Göring was not admiring his estate. His gaze was fixed on the contrails that scored the sky to the south. Long, straight lines of condensed vapor that could mean only one thing. American bombers, hundreds of them, were over Germany in daylight. And beside those heavy bomber trails were others, thinner, more numerous, weaving patterns of escort that extended all the way from the coast. The telephone on his desk had rung minutes earlier with a report from Luftwaffe operations that Göring had listened to in silence. Single-engine American fighters had been identified over Berlin itself. Not the twin-engine P-38 Lightnings that sometimes made the journey, their range already troubling enough. Single-engine fighters. Mustangs. The word fell into his consciousness like a stone into dark water. For a man who had once promised that no enemy aircraft would ever reach the Reich capital, who had sworn that if Allied bombs fell on German soil, his name was not Göring, but Meyer. The contrails above Berlin represented more than a military reversal. They represented the end of everything. The story of the Luftwaffe's decline could be told in many ways, through statistics of aircraft production or tables of pilot losses, through the grinding arithmetic of attrition over the skies of Europe. But for those who understood aerial warfare at its deepest level, the story could be reduced to a single question: how far could a fighter fly? In 1940, when Messerschmitt Bf-109s dueled with Spitfires over the English Channel during the Battle of Britain, German pilots had learned the bitter lesson of insufficient range. They had crossed the Channel with perhaps 20 minutes of combat time over England before fuel concerns forced them home, leaving the bombers they were meant to protect vulnerable during the crucial final approach to target and the desperate flight back to France. The experience had been frustrating, but not fatal. Britain survived, but Germany's ambitions had been continental, and the Luftwaffe had adapted to the mission of supporting ground operations where range was measured in tens of miles rather than hundreds. Then came the bombers. American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators began appearing over occupied Europe in 1942, massive four-engine aircraft flying in combat box formations, bristling with 50-caliber machine guns, each bomber a flying fortress in more than name alone. The Americans came in daylight, rejecting the British strategy of night bombing, convinced that precision attacks on specific industrial targets would cripple German war production more effectively than area bombing of cities. It was a strategy that depended on a simple premise: the bombers, flying in mutually supporting formations, could fight their way to the target and back without fighter escort. For the Luftwaffe, the unescorted American bomber streams were not a threat, but an opportunity. German fighter pilots, among the most experienced and capable in the world, had developed tactics specifically for attacking heavy bombers. They approached from head-on, exploiting the relatively weak forward armament of the B-17s, closing at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour before breaking away beneath the formation. They attacked from the sun, from clouds, from angles where the defensive crossfire was weakest. Throughout 1943, the Luftwaffe exacted a terrible toll. On August 17th, 60 B-17s were shot down during raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, nearly 20% of the attacking force. On October 14th, during a second raid on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories, 291 bombers penetrated German airspace. 60 were shot down. 17 more were so badly damaged they never flew again, and 121 others limped home with varying degrees of battle damage. The Americans called it Black Thursday, They suspended deep penetration raids into Germany entirely, acknowledging what the Luftwaffe had proven with blood. Unescorted bombers, no matter how heavily armed, could not survive against determined fighter opposition. For a few months in late 1943, it seemed that Göring's Luftwaffe had won the battle for German airspace. The American bombers remained grounded or confined to targets within range of escort fighters like the P-47, Thunderbolt and P-38, Lightning, capable aircraft but limited by the physics of fuel consumption to perhaps 400 miles from their bases. Deep into Germany, the industrial heart of the Reich, the skies remained inviolate. But American industry was already solving the problem in ways the Luftwaffe had not anticipated. The P-51 Mustang had begun its life in 1940 as a privately funded project by North American Aviation, designed to British specifications for a fighter aircraft that could be produced rapidly to supplement RAF inventory. The early versions were promising but flawed. Powered by American Allison engines that performed well at low altitude, but lacked the supercharger technology necessary for high-altitude combat. The aircraft might have remained a footnote, relegated to ground attack roles, except for a suggestion from a British test pilot. Replace the Allison with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The transformation was profound. Fitted with the Packard-built version of the Merlin V1650, the P-51B became what aeronautical engineers would later describe as one of the most perfectly realized fighter aircraft of the war. It was fast, capable of 440 miles per hour at altitude. It was maneuverable, able to turn with German Bf-109s and FW-190s. Its laminar flow wing design reduced drag to a minimum, squeezing every possible mile from each gallon of fuel. But most important was its range. With internal fuel tanks and two 108-gallon drop tanks slung beneath the wings, the P-51B could escort bombers to any target in Germany and still have fuel for combat over the target area. The impossible had become routine, single-engine fighters that could fly from England to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,000 miles. The Luftwaffe first encountered P-51s in significant numbers in December 1943, but the full implications did not become apparent until early 1944, when the American 8th Air Force made a fundamental change in doctrine. Previously, escort fighters had been instructed to remain with the bombers at all costs, flying defensive formations that allowed German fighters to choose the time and place of engagement. In January 1944, under the leadership of General Jimmy Doolittle, new orders transformed the mission of the fighter escorts: pursue and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever found. The Mustangs were unleashed. What followed was not merely air combat, but a systematic campaign of attrition that German fighter forces could not survive. The P-51s did not wait for Luftwaffe fighters to attack the bomber streams. They went hunting. They swept ahead of the formations. They lingered after the bombers turned for home. They dropped down to strafe German airfields, catching aircraft on the ground during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. The sound of the Mustang's Merlin engine became the acoustic signature of this new phase of the air war. A deep, growling purr that could be distinguished from the higher pitch of German inline engines and the rougher note of radial-powered American fighters. To German pilots scrambling from airfields across the Reich, that sound meant danger. It meant American fighters with enough fuel to chase them anywhere, with enough performance to catch them, with enough firepower, 650 caliber machine guns, to destroy them. The statistics of attrition mounted with relentless inevitability. In February 1944, during a week of sustained operations the Americans called Big Week, the 8th Air Force launched 3D-800 bomber sorties against German aircraft production facilities, escorted by fighters that included growing numbers of Mustangs. The Luftwaffe lost 355 fighters destroyed and 100 damaged, losses they could not replace. Piloted by men whose experience could not be replicated in the abbreviated training programs that were all Germany's fuel-starved economy could sustain. In March, The raids extended to Berlin itself. On March 6th, the day Göring stood at his window watching contrails over the capital, 730 American bombers struck the city, escorted by 801 fighters, including 174 P-51 Mustangs of the 4th, 354th and 357th Fighter Groups. 69 German fighters were shot down. The Luftwaffe claimed 69 American aircraft destroyed, but the actual losses were 37 bombers and 11 fighters. The math was simple and brutal. For every American aircraft lost, nearly 2 German fighters fell from the sky. This was not a battle of attrition Germany could win. Göring had built the Luftwaffe around a doctrine of tactical air power supporting ground operations, around fighters designed for the ranges and combat durations of continental warfare. The Bf-109, despite continuous upgrades and modifications that had kept it competitive throughout the war, was fundamentally a short-range interceptor with perhaps 90 minutes of flight time. The FW-190, a superb fighter in its own right, suffered similar range limitations. German designers had focused on rate of climb, ceiling, and maneuverability, the attributes necessary for intercepting bomber formations. They had not anticipated an opponent who could build a fighter with long-range cruise economy and high-altitude combat performance, an aircraft that could fly escort missions of 6 hours or more and still fight effectively at the end. The Mustang represented a synthesis of capabilities that German engineering had considered mutually exclusive: range or performance, escort duty or air superiority, strategic reach or tactical efficiency. The Americans, with their vast industrial capacity and willingness to iterate designs rapidly, had achieved all simultaneously. The Mustang could escort bombers deep into Germany, then drop tanks and fight as a pure interceptor. It could strafe airfields, then climb back to altitude and engage fighters. It could absorb battle damage with its liquid-cooled engine's robust design and still return to base. It was not one aircraft, but 3: escort fighter, air superiority fighter, and ground attack aircraft, packaged in an airframe so aerodynamically clean that German pilots reported with frustration that trying to shake a pursuing Mustang was nearly impossible. 3. Transformation in German pilot morale was as significant as the tactical shift. In 1940 and 1941, Luftwaffe fighter pilots had been among the elite of the Wehrmacht, men who flew with confidence born of superior training and combat experience. Many were aces several times over, with victory tallies that reached into the dozens or hundreds. They flew aircraft they understood intimately, that responded to their inputs with the predictability of long familiarity. They operated over friendly territory or occupied zones where forced landings meant safety rather than capture. By early 1944, that world had evaporated. The veterans were dead or exhausted, grounded by wounds or transferred to training units in desperate attempts to pass their knowledge to replacements who would have weeks rather than years to absorb it. The replacements climbed into cockpits with perhaps 150 hours of total flight time, facing American pilots with 400 hours and combat experience gained in skies where mistakes meant returning to base damaged rather than dying in flames. The Mustangs represented more than technological superiority. They represented systematic, institutional advantage, the ability of American military culture to train competent pilots in large numbers, to replace losses faster than they accumulated, to improve tactics through analysis rather than tradition, to treat aerial combat as a problem, admitting of solutions rather than a test of warrior spirit. German fighter pilots who survived encounters. With Mustangs' reported experiences, that would have seemed impossible years earlier. They described American pilots who flew with discipline and coordination, maintaining formation integrity even under attack, supporting each other with overlapping fields of fire. They described aircraft that could match the Bf-109 in a climb, that could dive away from FW-190s, that had enough fuel to pursue damaged German fighters all the way back to their airfields. They described, most tellingly, the psychological impact of knowing that the sky no longer belonged to Germany. Every takeoff could end in death. Every combat was fought with one eye on the fuel gauge, knowing that the Americans could stay and fight, while German pilots had to break off and flee. Every landing approach was vulnerable to Mustangs that patrolled near German bases, waiting for fighters at their most helpless. The sound of the Merlin engine became a herald of doom, a mechanical voice that spoke in the accent of American industrial might, reminding German pilots with every sortie that they faced not merely an opponent, but an empire of production that could replace every loss 3 times over. When Göring received reports of P-51s over Berlin, he understood with the clarity that comes from witnessing the impossible that the air war was lost. Not lost in the sense that battles might be won or temporary advantages gained, but lost in the fundamental strategic sense that victory was no longer achievable. The Luftwaffe could not protect German industry from daylight bombing. It could not prevent American fighters from ranging freely over the Reich. It could not replace losses quickly enough to maintain numerical parity, could not train pilots effectively enough to maintain qualitative superiority, could not develop new aircraft fast enough to regain technological advantage. The Mustang had not merely outperformed German fighters, it had rendered the entire German air defense system obsolete. The layered fighter defenses, the early warning networks, the carefully positioned airfields, all of it was predicated on the assumption that American fighters could only escort bombers partway to target. With P-51s providing coverage from takeoff to landing, German fighters had to engage through screens of escorts, had to fight their way through Mustangs to reach bombers, had to survive the return journey through more Mustangs waiting to intercept damaged aircraft. The attrition mathematics became inescapable. Every major raid cost the Luftwaffe more than it could afford to lose. The sound of those Merlin engines over Berlin, a sound Göring could not hear from Hall but knew was there, above his capital, above the heart of the Reich, represented more than the failure of the Luftwaffe. It represented the vindication of a strategic approach to warfare that Germany had never fully embraced. The Americans had not sought to build the perfect fighter for the perfect mission. They had sought to build a good fighter for multiple missions, an aircraft that could be mass-produced, easily maintained, and flown by pilots trained to competence rather than brilliance. They had pursued range and reliability over marginal gains in performance. They had accepted the need for external fuel tanks, for drop-away auxiliary fuel systems, for all the ungainly additions necessary to extend operational radius. German engineering, with its pursuit of technical perfection and aesthetic purity, had rejected such compromises. The Bf-109 remained fast and maneuverable, but short-legged. The FW-190 remained powerful, but range-limited. Even advanced designs like the FW-190D and the jet-powered Me-262, superior in some respects to any Allied fighter, came too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. The Luftwaffe had lost, not because its aircraft were inferior in every metric, but because the metrics that mattered, range, sustainability, replaceability, were ones German military culture had undervalued. By war's end, P-51 Mustangs would be credited with 4,950 aerial victories in the European theater, more than any other Allied fighter. They would destroy 4,131 aircraft on the ground during strafing attacks, systematically eliminating the Luftwaffe's ability to regenerate its forces. They would escort bomber streams that dropped 1.5 million tons of bombs on German industry, erasing the productive capacity that sustained the Wehrmacht. But statistics, however impressive, failed to capture what the Mustang meant in the broader context of the war. The demonstration that American industry, given a clear requirement and sufficient resources, could produce weapon systems that won through systematic advantage rather than momentary superiority, that prevailed through sustainability rather than initial excellence. The P-51 was not the best fighter in every category. It was the best fighter for the mission that mattered most, destroying the Luftwaffe's ability to contest Allied air superiority over Europe. In this, it succeeded completely. The contrails, above Berlin that March afternoon, traced more than vapor trails in cold air. They traced the arc of empire declining, of a military force that had once seemed invincible reduced to irrelevance by an opponent that understood warfare in industrial terms. Göring, watching from his window, was witnessing the visible manifestation of a truth he had perhaps always known but could no longer deny, that modern war would be won not by the nation with the bravest warriors or the most sophisticated tactics, but by the nation that could build more, supply more, and replace losses. Faster than they occurred, the Mustang was abundance-made aeronautic, American productive capacity refined into aluminum and steel, and given wings. It represented the industrialization of warfare taken to its logical conclusion, where aircraft were produced by the thousands, pilots trained by the tens of thousands, and combat operations sustained at a tempo that simply overwhelmed opponents who could not match the scale of effort. For Germany, a nation fighting on multiple fronts with dwindling resources and a shrinking pool of trained personnel, there was no counter to this approach. They could build better aircraft in small numbers or adequate aircraft in larger numbers, but they could not match the Americans who built very good aircraft in enormous numbers. The Merlin engine's distinctive sound faded from the skies above Berlin as the raid concluded, and the bombers turned west for home, their Mustang escorts surrounding them in protective formations that no Luftwaffe attack could penetrate. In his study, Göring remained at the window long after the contrails dissipated, staring at empty sky that no longer belonged to Germany. The man who had once been Hitler's designated successor, who had commanded the Luftwaffe in its glory years, who had promised the German people that their skies would remain inviolate, now confronted a future where every promise had become a lie and every certainty had dissolved into chaos. The war would continue for another 14 months, and the Luftwaffe would continue to fight with the desperate courage of men defending their homeland against impossible odds. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The moment German pilots heard the sound of Merlin engines over their own capital, the moment single-engine American fighters ranged freely in skies that Germany had sworn to defend, the war in the air was over. What remained was only the arithmetic of destruction, the grinding calculus of attrition working itself toward inevitable conclusion. The Mustang had done more than defeat the Luftwaffe. It had proven that in the crucible of industrial warfare, victory belonged to those who could sustain the fight longest, who could absorb losses and return stronger, who measured success not in momentary triumph, but in systematic, relentless pressure applied until the opponent's capacity for resistance collapsed entirely. In this new form of warfare, the sound of abundance, thousands of engines, millions of gallons of fuel, billions of rounds of ammunition, was louder than the sound of courage, more decisive than the sound of skill, and ultimately unstoppable. The 650 caliber machine guns of the P-51 Mustang spoke in that voice of industrial democracy, and when Göring heard their echo in reports from the front, he knew the conversation was over.